Hello, welcome back to the Life on Earth podcast. Hope you guys are having a great week so far. Audemars Piguet is such an interesting brand from a collector's perspective because obviously today the watches that they produce are very sought after, and you know the names. The Royal Oak is such a sought after piece, and something that I've been thinking about recently has to do with their vintage watches and how it almost feels like Audemars Piguet vintage watches, let's take the Royal Oak out of it, are quite hard to come by. And when you do, you really have to focus on things like condition to be able to find really exceptional quality vintage Audemars Piguet watches. And so I wanted to dive into this subject and talk through some of these because I had the opportunity to handle a vintage Audemars Piguet time-only piece, the reference 5259. You might have seen it on the Life on the Wrist Instagram account with beautiful, it's a time-only piece with beautiful Roman numerals for hour markers. And I wanted to just kind of discuss this topic and sort of where I think this has gone. So, as I mentioned, I'm going to kind of exclude the Audemars Piguet Royal Oaks. There's a really great article on the Christie's website where they kind of talk about why collectors love Audemars Piguet Royal Oak watches, and I encourage you to look at it because it does go through some of the true reasons why collectors really love the Royal Oak. And I have nothing against the Royal Oak. I love the watch. It's a historic piece for Audemars Piguet, very well sought after, and and they have some really beautiful examples, especially the ones with additional complications other than just time and date. Their perpetual calendars, in my opinion, are some of the best looking perpetual calendars out there, especially vintage models. You can find some from sort of the neo-vintage era of the 1990s, which are extremely beautiful. But what I wanted to focus on is sort of maybe if you want to think of the Royal Oak as a sports watch, something a little bit more about maybe a little bit more classical in I guess the loose term that is, and discuss why I think Audemars Piguet vintage watches, whether that's a time-only piece or a complication that isn't in a Royal Oak case or chronographs from the brand, are relatively rare. So I actually think it goes back to when, let's say, I think it was probably about 20 years ago when steel sports watches were not the most interesting thing to collectors. I think many collectors were very interested in very classical complications, whether that's a perpetual calendar, annual calendar, and this goes probably back into the 90s and 80s too. But they were really focused on classical-looking watches with high complications, and obviously the three brands that really stick out when you think about those types of watches are Patek Philippe, Audemars Piguet, and Vacheron Constantin. And the execution of a lot of these complications varied across these three brands. I think they each had a very isolated aesthetic for the pieces that they were producing, and would capture the attention of collectors during that time. But what you notice today, if you ever go to if you look at auction catalogs or just look at what's online when it comes to vintage watches, it's a little bit easier to find vintage Vacheron Constantin watches and Patek Philippe watches, and I'll say from maybe let's take out sort of the ultimate rare pieces that these brands have. If you think about some of the more simplistic complications, let's just say your full calendar pieces or a time only piece from these brands, there are some accessible models out there that you can find, and at an attractive price point for most collectors. But Audemars Piguet seems to stand out, and I was researching this on online just to see if there's anything about this topic, and I found an article from 2012 from Rarity where they talk about how I'll kind of quote the article. It says, "Great vintage watches from Audemars Piguet do not come up for sale often. They are rarer than vintage Vacherons and Pateks, especially in modern sizes and aesthetics. There are a few vintage APs that do well at auction, obviously the early Royal Oaks, but the traditional chronographs like this that pull down 386,000 and this triple date moon phase chrono that made almost 90,000. Next, and so they kind of describe how these pieces are not coming up for auction very often, and they kind of get into the idea that in the article they were looking at some of the upcoming vintage Audemars Piguet watches that were coming up for sale at these auction houses. But even the sentiment in 2012 was that these watches were difficult to come by and a little bit more on the rare side. And I think it's a function of two things. Either the production of these pieces were lower than their counterparts at Vacheron Constantin and Patek Philippe, or collectors during the early years of these brands, like I said, kind of like I was describing, when the classical watches, classical complications and chronographs were really the in thing, when those watches were being sold and during the time where it was a little bit more accessible to get these watches, there is a possibility that a lot of collectors might have gobbled a lot of these up and are not letting them go. So I thought I would talk about each of the two. So the first one that I mentioned was the idea that maybe Audemars Piguet didn't produce as high quantities of these pieces compared to Vacheron Constantin and Patek Philippe. I have a hard time believing, and I'll preface this with saying I have no empirical evidence of this, but I have a hard time believing that Audemars Piguet would have produced a lower quantity of the watches in these classical designs than Patek Philippe and Vacheron Constantin, because to me, they're competing with these. They were competing with these companies throughout their history, and so, in order to do that, they would have to produce watches and have availability of these watches, in order to kind of stamp their mark on the watch market during that era. And so, it's hard for me to believe that they might have produced these in lower quantities. Now, maybe what they were focusing on was a little bit wider, and perhaps there might have been lower quantities of these individual pieces, but I have a hard time believing that it would be substantial enough to make these watches more rare and more sought after by collectors, because they would have produced a lower quantity of these pieces. So I really think the crux of this discussion comes down to the idea that collectors, when these watches were available, were purchasing them, and they've kept them, and they haven't really let them go. And I can see why they would do things like that, because there are some incredibly beautiful historic pieces manufactured by Audemars Piguet that are completely exquisite, and I would hate to get rid of them. I'll leave a link in the show notes to an article on Rarity where they went into the archives of Audemars Piguet and go over some of the watches that they've got in their museum sort of collection, because they really are phenomenal examples in great condition. Now, I don't know enough about whether these were restored by Audemars Piguet to look as good as they do. I think a lot of brands, when they do buy watches for their museum collections, they end up trying to restore them to look as new as possible, which to some might feel like they are getting rid of the life of the watch, or maybe putting it into a state that is unrealistic for those specific pieces. But the watches themselves are incredibly beautiful. I mean, I'm looking at this article and I see an incredibly beautiful perpetual calendar, reference 5516, which was made in 1957. That has so much personality on the wrist and almost looks like it has a double-stepped case with really beautiful lugs. I really encourage you to check out the article to see some of these pieces, because I think as collectors, you'll probably have a similar reaction to what I'm having, which is these pieces are incredibly beautiful, incredibly well-designed and well-proportioned. It would be very difficult to, to let one of these watches go, because boy, they are really, really beautiful. And so what I think actually is, during this time, these collectors were gobbling these pieces up as quickly as they possibly could to add to their collection because of how beautiful they were. And in a way, like maybe a little bit less mainstream than Patek Philippe, because I think Patek Philippe sort of holds the status above everyone else in some regards. But they were buying these pieces, and I don't think anyone is looking to get rid of them anytime soon. I think there was a Rarity Talking Watches where a really beautiful Audemars Piguet, a vintage chronograph, was shown, and it's probably one of the I think the individual mentioned that it was probably one of the most expensive Audemars Piguet chronographs that was ever bought by him, and I'll get the name. I can't believe I'm blanking on this. It was the Talking Watches with Alfredo Paramico, and he mentioned that there was a really great chronograph that he had the opportunity to purchase from the 1940s in stainless steel and pink gold, and I don't think he's sold that. I can't tell you definitively, but I don't think I've seen anything online where this watch went up for sale. And that kind of got me thinking about this watch that I was able to experience, which is a reference 5259 from Audemars Piguet. Something that is mentioned on the Hodinkee article is the idea that the pieces that have modern aesthetics and modern case sizes are really desired by collectors because they fit so well into, obviously, a modern collection. But where that line sort of is drawn is what I'm interested about. So the 5259 has a 34 millimeter case, which is on the smaller side for any collector, but especially for modern collectors. And so it's an interesting piece to wear because for me it fits great. My wrist, it fits phenomenally. But to think about if this fits in a modern collection or if it'd be desired by modern collectors, I think it still does because of how rare these time-only Audemars Piguet watches are. And at 34 millimeters, it can squeeze into that maybe dress watch piece. The 5259 also used a very thin movement, and so the watch sits very elegantly on the wrist. I also think the rarity of this dial, I haven't seen another 5259 with this Roman numeral dial, which I think is a fairly rare feature compared to some of the other 5259s, which have simple, hour indices that are not Roman, but are still really, really beautiful. And so, wearing this watch, it's an interesting experience for me because I do think that it is a good representation of the rarity of these pieces because it's hard to find 5259s on the market. 1, 2, I think they do have some sort of they demand a little bit of a premium price when it comes to if you take another time only watch from another brand of this era. I think it's a similar sort of situation, or it's a different sort of price for these pieces. And I think it demonstrates the power of this brand and the rarity of these pieces and how sought after they really are. Just a couple comments. You've probably seen this 5259 on the Instagram Life on the Wrist at Life on the Wrist on Instagram, but what's really cool about this watch, and what I love about it is the right side of the dial towards the 8, 9, and 10 hour marker. You can see a really slight sort of patina color coming through, which is a nice indication that the dial is aging quite nicely. It is not the whole dial, and so I think there must have been something that happened with the left side of the case, whether it was exposed, that side of the case was exposed to sunlight or maybe a little bit of moisture here and there, but certainly is something unique about this specific watch. and kind of makes it a really nice example. But of course, this is just me kind of talking about why I think Audemars Piguet watches are rare and why collecting them can be an interesting experience because of the rarity of them, but also a pleasure to wear on the wrist when you think about the quality of the watches and the movements and finishing that were put to them. I'll be covering the 5259 on lifeonthewrist.com, so stay tuned for the article that we release about the watch. We'll also be covering it on our website, so stay tuned on our YouTube channel. So stay tuned for that. That's going to be coming up very soon at Life on the Wrist. With that said, I think that's really going to wrap this podcast up. I know it was a one-topic podcast, but I do think it's an interesting discussion to be had. And if you want to continue the discussion, head over to the Life on the Wrist Instagram, give us a follow, and send us a message. I'd love to hear your thoughts on why you think Audemars Piguet watches are on the rare side. Do you collect Audemars Piguet vintage watches? I mean, the collecting of Audemars Piguet watches is definitely something that I would love to pursue, and it's an interesting brand to document sort of their history. So let us know on Instagram, Life on the Wrist. You'll be able to find us. I'm pretty sure you'll be able to find us very easily. Let us know what you think about this podcast. If you wouldn't mind leaving a rating on this podcast, it really does help me out. Share this podcast with a friend who might be interested in watches, and be sure to head over to the website lifeonthewrist.com and all of our social media accounts if you want to get some more watch news and content. You can certainly head over to our social medias and website. With that said, guys, thank you so much for listening to this podcast, and until next time.